Hi, my name is Elizabeth Cunningham. I'm here with Big Book Analytics. Our goal is to help authors write a query letter that agents can't ignore. And how do we do that? Well, we offer an unbiased approach to giving feedback to your book blurb, to helping you find comparable titles for your book, and also for helping you find literary agents that match your manuscript. And we're very excited to have with us here today Neely Tubati Alexander. Neely is the author of the debut novel Love Buzz, which has been described as absolutely delightful by Good Morning America. In addition to her debut, Neely has already gone on to release her second novel in a not so perfect world. And she's here with us today to discuss her querying journey and how she landed her literary agent and tips that you can use to help your query letter improve as well. All right. Could you just tell me a little bit about your writing background and what inspired you to write your book that got representation eventually, which was Love Buzz?
Sure. So Love Buzz came out in May of this year of 2023, and it was probably a 2.5-year journey. And that was after the book was sort of, from the time that the book was an idea to the point of publication. And that's a relatively short period of time. I know it's a lot longer for others, just depending on the process. But even before that, there was a lot that happened, right? So I had written a book in 2020, had always had the interest and idea in writing a novel, always had it sort of as a someday dream. That never really came to fruition. I started and stopped over the years, and then, had a family and got a real job, and all these things kind of got in the way. And then when COVID hit, I found myself, working from home. I worked with startups and small businesses, and many of them were really struggling. I lost about 50% of my business kind of overnight, and really started to write again as a form of self-care. I looked forward to, at the end of the day, sort of locking myself in the guest room, pretending I was at a hotel or a resort, somewhere else. And I wrote, and it started to become the thing that I looked forward to at the end of the day. So that book took me about 8 months or so to draft. It was the first time I'd ever finished anything. So I sort of thought, great, I'm off to the races. I finished the book. That's the hardest part of this whole thing. I soon learned that is not the hardest part of this. And then I hired a developmental editor who was someone that I really admired. I had seen her posts and videos online, and she gave me a pretty scathing developmental edit, which I wasn't expecting. And so then I had to decide, do I take what I learned from this and try to salvage this book, or do I take what I learned and apply it to something new? I chose the latter. And then sort of out of sheer grit and determination of that, not wanting that situation to define my writing process or career, I wrote what would become Love Buzz. And that was sort of in a really fast-paced, again, just driven by not wanting that situation to be my defining moment. And then finished it in probably September of 2021.
Okay. Wow. That's fast. So I guess when you got to that point when you had finished it and you were ready to start jumping into the process of researching and figuring out who you wanted to pinpoint for a literary agent, how did you approach that process?
Yeah. So all the while I was doing that work kind of in the interim, I definitely looked at books, the acknowledgments of books that I really loved or that I felt like were similar in my genre, or gosh, I would love to be represented by the same person, same agent. So I used acknowledgments pages. I used Query Tracker a lot because there was a lot of great information there, probably the best tool that's out there. And looked up who repped. I Googled a lot, right? I looked up who repped some of the authors that I felt like I would want similar careers to, or that I wrote similarly to, and just started building the list from there.
Okay. And over, I guess, what period of time did you send out your queries, and how many agents, if you know? I mean, you probably do because you used Query Tracker, but how many agents did you send to?
So I had built a list of almost 80 agents. It was a
Oh,
pretty
wow.
significant list. And that was again built from Query Tracker, and I continued to add to it when I started querying because there are some really amazing reports in Query Tracker that you can use. So if someone would request, you can pull a report that says these are the agents that request like this agent. So, agents
Mm,
that I maybe hadn't heard of or didn't know of, or hadn't been on my radar, I added them based on that because I knew that they were into or interested in similar books. But I had about 80 on my list. I ended up querying about 30. Um, and I did it in chunks of like 10 to 15, probably more like 10.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, so did you personalize each of those query letters, or how is your approach for the personalization aspect of the letter?
Yeah. So the letter was 99% the same for everyone. And then I
Right.
personalize it in the first like sentence, maybe two max. I had no personal connections to anyone that I was querying. Connections
Right.
history, I had nothing, right? So my personalizations were very much around, I saw your manuscript wish list and felt like this could be a good fit based on what you're looking for, or I read this article that you wrote. So I definitely tried to show that I knew something about them, or that there was a specific reason that I was querying them, not just you're one of 30 or
Right.
so I did do the research in that regard of trying
Mm,
to find like what is the specific reason that I want to query this person and making sure that they knew what that was.
mm. And I guess along with that, how did you get any like good response from that? Where did anybody say like, oh wow, like I'm glad that you mentioned this, or like yeah, did any kind of like personal connection in that way, or do you think it had an effect?
Not really, to be honest. I do think there was one, if I think back to the responses, there was one that where I had called out a recent cover reveal for one of their authors. And I had said in my personalization, loved this new cover, congrats. And it
Mm,
had just come out. So it was really timely.
uh,
So that one, I think when she responded, she said, yes, in love with this cover too. And that was
uh,
so I think that was the only one that I really received a personalization on. But I think that also goes to show it can be about more than just yourself. Um,
right.
of what you include in the personalization. And rather just than it being like, hey, here's why I'm a good fit for you. It can be a little bit of fan appreciation too.
Right. Yeah. That's a good one. Um, so something that I think, at least I don't know about you, but I particularly dread this task, comparable titles. Did you use any? And if so, how did you find them?
Yeah, so it's always a tricky one, and it's always a tough topic. And I think the thing that I've learned most is that when I started writing, or before I was sort of in this world, still kind of in my bubble of just writing and trying to break in, I always sort of viewed comp titles as bad or negative, or like you want your book to be so unique and special that there's nothing like it that exists. And the truth is there
Mm-hmm.
always is something like it, right? Or something, and the comps are hugely, hugely helpful and relevant. Um, I'm trying to remember what the comps were. Gosh, so I used a movie comp. I used the movie Serendipity, which was like a 90s rom-com film.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that it was like a modern retelling of that film. But anytime you can say X meets X and people will immediately know what that is, it's super, super helpful. So my next book that's coming out in March, I've been calling it The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren, but set in the
Mm,
world of gaming. So as close as we can get to that kind of really specific, I think is super helpful. I definitely looked at books that I've read, tried to read, anytime when I knew that this book was going to have a gaming element, I looked up as many books as I could, not even just for comps, but just to read them, right? To
right.
get a better understanding of what already existed in the space. And then potentially they could have been used as comps too. So
Mm,
I think reading and finding books that fit those same themes or elements is really helpful. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've had and that I've seen other authors have when trying to figure out comps is, what are you comping? Is it the themes? Is it
right.
the setting? Is it the location? And so I think it's good to have a little bit of both, and that you're not using too large of a comp where, if you're comping Where the Crawdads Sing or like that, it can almost be viewed as a negative because
Right.
that in a lot of editors' minds and agents' minds is a unicorn. And to
Mm.
replicate that unicorn can be really hard, right? So
Right.
a book that had mass appeal that people would immediately recognize if you said the title is really helpful, but not necessarily the one that was like the runaway hit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, makes total sense. And that's part of the difficulty of that balance, right? Like it has to be a little bit, it has to be popular enough, but not so popular that everybody knows it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess if you were to well, let me rewind actually. I guess the query letter that ended up securing your agent. I think you had mentioned that you had to rewrite your query letter. So the one that ended up securing the agent, what do you think you did that made it kind of stand out, and how is it different from that first draft that you were sending out?
Yeah, so I think I initially very much underestimated the importance of the query letter. I sort of naively assumed people will just sort of skim it and go straight to the pages, and they want to see that they want to see your writing style and they want to see that first. And that may be true for some agents, but I very quickly learned how important the query letter is. And I had one agent that was kind enough to respond and say, I really liked the pages, but I just didn't get what I needed from the query. And that was my wake up call of
Mm,
not doing enough heavy lifting with this letter. Um, so the main thing that I changed was I made it a lot clearer and I made it a lot more formulaic in terms of the structure and, didn't try to do something new or exciting, right? Because I think that's always as authors, our goal sometimes is to try to,
uh,
you know, go for shock value or go for something different or unique. But
mhm,
the really is I just want to be able to quickly tell what's happening and like really want to know exactly what's going on very quickly and be able to, this meets this and then okay, I get it, right? As quickly as possible. So
mhm,
being not to shock or, stop someone in their tracks, but to really be able to make it as clear as possible as quickly as possible. So I definitely went through and cleaned it up, made it shorter and much more precise.
Okay, yeah. And do you think the biggest part of, or I guess I should rephrase that. What was the biggest part of cleaning up and making it more precise? Was it mostly your short summary, or was it anything in particular, or kind of everything?
Probably that middle chunk that was about the summary of the book, only
Okay,
including the things that needed to be known for the story, and that it wasn't focused on um, that you're not giving away too much. Also,
right.
right? That it was just kind of what is relevant for
Mm,
purposes. It wasn't. It's not meant to be a full synopsis. Some agents will ask for a full synopsis separately, but that is a whole separate document from.
right.
So trying to give too much information, and it's hard, right? It's really hard to condense your book into 400 words or less.
Yeah.
But it forces us to sort of say, okay, what are the most important things that someone needs to know, and to only focus on those things. So I think I cut out like 150 words
Oh,
um,
wow. Okay.
the second time around. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess that being said, what advice would you give to people who are writing a query letter? Is there any insights that you have that you would offer someone who's kind of doing it for the first time, or maybe even trying to revise their query letter?
Yeah, I would say treat it like the pages, right? That you are going through an editing process and revising, and that you treat it like just like you would the pages, that you want that it as crisp and as edited as possible. And that there is sort of a method, right, for in a format for how to do that. And you can find these things online, but it really is to start with the comps and like the word count and the genre, right? And to show that you understand what that looks like and what it is, and then to kind of give the description of the book, of current state, what the hook is, and then how kind of what the larger themes are that you're going to be looking for, and then to ask for or sort of give the closing pitch too. So there's definitely a formulaic process. I'd be curious if your recommendations look any different than that, but when you think about an agent sitting down and reading maybe 15 queries in a row, which is oftentimes what they do, right? They'll sit down and
Right.
read them in batches. Um, you don't know what came before yours. So
Hmm.
you really have to just be ready to capture them right away with as clear and concise information as possible.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so once you jumping ahead now to you sent your query letter and then you did actually secure an agent. So how did you, after you got the agent, how did you guys collaborate if you did to further polish your manuscript? Was she more like hands-on? Did she want to go into the editing process a little bit, or was it kind of ready to just pitch to publishing houses at that point?
Yeah, I will say actually, I received a revise and resubmit from an agent,
Right.
and then I received an offer from that agent, and then went back to the agents um, that still had the query. And then my agent that I ended up working with was one that I had gone back to, who had not previously responded. So I would just throw that in there to say there is a world of reasons why someone doesn't respond to or immediately respond to a query. And sometimes agents, because they are receiving such high volume, will wait until they get an offer of representation notice, and then they'll look at it, right? Or
Mhm.
someone else has vetted it for them potentially, right? So
Mhm.
there's a million reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a no just because someone is not responding. So I just would throw that in there too, because there's a lot of ways that you can get to the point of getting an agent. But my agent was very involved initially in editing. Editors more and more at publishing houses, are playing larger roles. They really are your liaison through the entire production process too. And so more and more they are looking for manuscripts to come in really polished and really well done, where there's minimal editing to do, which sounds counterintuitive because they're an editor. They're having to not only fall in love with it themselves, but they're essentially pitching it and selling it internally to their sales and marketing team, their publisher. So it has to be in a shape that it can not only appeal to the editor, but to their larger team as well. They're typically the decision maker, but they are getting feedback from, the rest of their team. So we worked on it for probably for a couple of weeks. We worked on it and made edits. So she was the first person to give me editorial feedback. And then I made those edits before we went out on submission.
Okay. And what was the submission process like? If you could kind of describe that.
It was a lot like the querying process. So my agent made a list of who she thought the editors were that would be a good fit for it. I had no idea who any of these people were until I looked them up, because you spend so much of your time on the front end, you don't really see the back end of how, or at least for me, right? I hadn't
Right.
gone that far or that deep in my research. And so I started looking up the people that she had there at the different publishing houses, and it was amazing to see what books they had worked on. And that was a really cool list to see of who was going to
Mhm.
be reading my book. But I think we came up with about 16 or so editors at various imprints, and she sends it off to them. She basically used my query letter and made some small tweaks, but she used my query letter for the letter that was going to go out with the submission. So it very much is like querying. And I've heard that from other authors as well, that they essentially will use your query letter,
Mm,
mission letter to editors, because it's serving the same purpose.
right.
So we went out to those. We went out on a Thursday. This process happened pretty quickly for me, which again, it can be such a varying experience depending on so many circumstances. But we went on a Thursday. We started getting feedback on Monday, and then within 2 weeks, we had gone to auction. An auction meaning there are multiple editors and publishers interested, which is really exciting.
Mm.
And then it's like kind of like a real estate deal where they bring me your best and final offer by this date. And then my agent and I kind of went over, what we had, and made a final decision from there.
Wow. That must have been very exciting.
Yeah, it was overwhelming for sure.
Yeah.
We did have the opportunity to have editor calls ahead of time. So
Okay.
you get a chance to like this, get on a Zoom call, talk to an
Right.
editor. They'll tell you what they really loved about it. They'll tell you maybe what give you a preview of what some of their editorial notes might look like. So you can get a sense for, do we creatively align on, our vision
Mm,
of this book? So that's a really insightful conversation to be able to have too ahead of time.
right. Yeah. And it's interesting that your query letter kind of pops up again. I mean, it kind of serves a dual purpose. It's a pretty important
Yeah,
document.
I was surprised by that as well. I didn't necessarily realize that. And your agent can rewrite it, and they will if they think
Right.
it needs to be. But yeah, a lot of that content potentially. And then I will say too, even some of that content ended up as part of the cover copy as well,
Oh, wow. Okay.
or can at least inspire it, right? Because
Right, right,
some components of it that again, it's all sort of that same type of goal in the way that you're
right.
communicating the content of the book. So yeah,
Hmm.
it can come back in quite a few ways.
Right. Yeah. So life after publishing. So I guess when it came to your book was coming out, and the marketing process, how involved were you in that process? Did you have any specific roles that you had to take on? And what was the publisher's roles? How did that play out?
Yeah, I knew nothing about how this process works. So it was very much a learning experience. It was really cool to see. And by the way, every author I've talked to has had a very different experience. So it just goes to show
Mm,
no one's path is the same, from querying to publication to how marketing and publicity goes, right? It's all very different. It depends on so many different factors. But I was very lucky. I had a very involved publicist and marketing team. It was really exciting. We had an initial kickoff call. So they kind of walk you through, hey, here's our plan for this book and what we plan on doing. And I will say, a majority of that is kind of the same things that we do for everyone, right? Which are kind of the standard things. And that's a good thing, right? Because you want like some of the standard stuff. So it's the trade publications that they're going to submit to for reviews, and, the book clubs that they might be submitting to, or things like that. So it's really cool to see kind of all of that come together. The Goodreads giveaways they might do, right? So they really take the helm of how all of that works, or at least for me, they did. And I think the things that I've learned through that process that I might do differently this time is knowing better what are the things that they do versus what are the things that I could be doing. So, for
mhm,
example, if there are festivals or book events that you want to go to, they might sign you up for it, but they may not that might not necessarily be on their list of things that they have, or
mhm,
who you want to potentially blurb your book. If you have people that you really would love to send it to, these are the areas where you can speak up a little bit more and
mhm.
provide feedback on. But ultimately, they have a well-oiled machine that they'll put you through and start you down the path on.
Okay. Did you have any unexpected challenges, or on the other hand, rewarding experiences that came from being a published author?
Oh gosh. I think so. So a highlight I will say was having Emily Giffen blurb the book, which was really exciting. She's,
Mm.
start to get into this world of authors that you've read and reading your book, or starting to build relationships with people. That's really, really cool. um,
Mm.
that to me was a highlight for sure of some of the authors that I've had exposure to during this process, and how much the community of authors really supports one another. Was really, I'd say, the highlight for me. um, the challenges are, I think, I'd say two. One is when you go into traditional publishing, and it's always kind of that ongoing debate of self-published versus traditional, right? You do give
Right.
up some level of control. And that is just part of the traditional process. And so for someone like me who has a type A personality and likes to have control over things, that can be a little challenging, right? Of now having
Mhm.
of decision making versus your own decision making.
Right.
And then the other, which is probably no surprise, is reviews, right? You sort of have to develop a thick skin, know that once a book goes out into the world, it's not yours anymore. It sort of belongs to the readership, and just kind of keep your head down and start working on the next thing, because it can be paralyzing if you put too much weight into the good or the bad. Uh,
Mhm.
you can read 20 good reviews, but the one negative review is the one that sticks with you. So you have
Mhm.
to figure out kind of where does your mental health come um, into play in all of it, and making sure that you are allowing for that creative, um, so you're not stifling yourself creatively by getting bogged down with some of those.
Right. It's so funny that you mentioned the difference between self-publishing and traditional publishing. That's actually my next question for you. So authors that are kind of struggling to choose one of those, what factors do you think they should consider when they're thinking about which route to go?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the answer I would say is knowing what your goals are and being really clear about what those are. For me, it was always going to be traditional. And the reason for that was because I wanted the most opportunity for commercial success. And I knew that that would be in the traditional path. It doesn't mean you can't get it self published, but there's a lot more challenge in being able to do so. And I knew I wanted opportunity for lists and for book clubs and things like that. And I mean like New York Times lists, or not, maybe not on this first book, right, but down the road.
Right.
And so I knew that those were the goals that I had for myself in my career, and that I had a better chance of getting those things being traditionally published. I wanted my book in airports. I wanted to be able to have, right. So my very specific goal list of what I wanted out of my career, the traditional path was more aligned to being able to get to those things. Doesn't mean it's impossible on the other side, right?
Right.
But those were the goals for myself. So I think you have to be really clear on what your goals are, and know which path is better. And it doesn't necessarily mean one's better than the other. But so, for example, you could do all of those things self-published, but are you willing to do the work, put in the effort of learning yourself how to do it, or potentially um, paying someone to do that, right, out of your
Mhm.
pocket?
Right.
So there's a lot of decision making that goes into that. But knowing the goals, I think, is the biggest thing.
Yeah, makes sense. Um, and then I guess this is kind of my final question. Do you have any resources that you would recommend? I guess probably specifically for the publishing process, anything that you kind of helped you along, like a podcast or a blog or a magazine, that's something that was really helpful to you?
Yeah, I love the Shit No One Tells You About Writing podcast. They do a
Okay.
book segment that is really, really helpful for query letters. I was listening to it. I still listen to it, but I was listening to it when I was querying. It was part of what helped me rewrite my query letter
Mm,
too. So I think that one, especially for authors who are querying or getting ready to query, is a huge one. That segment in particular is super helpful. Um, and otherwise, finding writing groups and finding critique partners and whatnot. And there's a couple ways to do that if you don't already have them. That podcast does I think twice a year, they will partner people up with groups. There's a Moms Who Write group on
mm,
Facebook that you can find partners for if that's something that you fit into. So there's a lot of different, if you go find them, they're there. Uh,
right.
there are a lot of different resources for finding writing partners, and having critique partners is really important and helpful.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I know we're at time, but actually, I do have one last question if you have a moment. Do you have any words of encouragement or wisdom for new authors that are kind of just embarking on this publishing journey?
Yeah, I would say keep going. And it sounds so cliche, but I mean it, I think, in a different way than most people would take that. Because if you look at, I'm a very sort of analytical person, right? So if you look at how many people kind of just in the world generally have an idea for a book, or have talked about writing a book, or want to write a book, and then you narrow that down to the number of people who actually sit down and start, and then the people who actually finish, right? And then the people who actually get to the point of querying, and so on and so on and so on. And that
Mm,
number dwindles significantly at every step. And this industry, more than anything, it really is about who's willing to go further down the path, and not give up, than anything else. And it's, again, not even in a rah-rah way, it's a pure numbers way.
mm,
Um, and so many authors will say, it was my 10th book that kind of broke through, or
right.
I wrote 10 books before I got an agent. And it really is the people who are willing to just keep going. And that's just the sheer force of momentum that got them to that point of whatever they've deemed as success. So it really is not about talent, it's about skill, and skill is something that you build, and it's through
Right.
time spent. So if you look at it that way and sort of take some of the emotion out of it, it really is about keeping on.
Right. Well, yeah, it's good words of wisdom. Well, thank you so much, Neely. I really appreciate this. It's been super helpful.